In the heart of a vast land where the earth cracked under the sun's unyielding gaze, there stood a village built upon salt and silence. It was a place where the white crystals gleamed like scattered stars across the ground, a substance revered and feared in equal measure. Salt was life. It preserved food, gave flavor to even the simplest meals, and brought wealth through trade with distant settlements. But salt was also punishment. Its sharpness could sting wounds, its grains could cut into skin, and its symbolism made it a weapon in the hands of those who held power. In this village, every child grew up knowing that salt was not just sprinkled onto food but onto their fates as well. And for one girl, salt would come to define her story. She was not like the others, at least not in the eyes of her stepfamily. Where other children were celebrated for their strength or cunning, she was called weak, fragile, or simply troublesome. She was not slow to learn, nor unwilling to work, but her stepmother had decided long ago that she would be treated as less. This judgment seeped into the way the girl was spoken to, the way her chores were doubled, and the way her cries were dismissed as noise unworthy of compassion. Her father, long gone from this world, had left her in the care of a woman who wore bitterness like a crown, and that crown weighed heavily on the girl's days. Salt in this household was never a blessing for her. While others tasted its sharp brilliance in their meals, she often tasted only its punishment. When she spilled a bowl of water, her stepmother would throw handfuls of salt at her feet, ordering her to sweep it up until her hands burned. When she failed to complete a task quickly enough, she would be made to carry heavy sacks of salt from one hut to another while her step-siblings laughed. Each punishment stung her body, but what hurt most was the laughter, the mockery that told her she was invisible in her suffering. The village itself thrived on the trade of salt. Men returned from long journeys with baskets of grains and slabs, and women carried small pouches tied to their waists like talismans. Rituals used salt to ward off spirits or cleanse a home after quarrels. Elders spoke of it as the silent crystal, holding within it the memory of oceans that once covered the land. But silence in the village was not just in the crystals. It was in the hearts of those who turned away from cruelty. When they saw the girl's stepmother sneering, when they heard the step-siblings jeering, most looked down or walked past. They told themselves it was not their matter. The salt of silence preserved their peace, but it left the girl abandoned. There were moments, in the heat of the day, when she would sit by the edge of the salt fields, her body aching, and stare at the horizon. The sun painted the world in white and gold, and she imagined walking beyond that horizon to a place where she was not weighed down by cruelty. But every time she rose to leave, her stepmother's voice pulled her back, harsh and sharp, a whip of words that reminded her of her place. She was told she was nothing, that she owed her life to the scraps she was given, that she should bow her head in gratitude even for her chains. The villagers, though not blind, chose to let it be. They muttered that some children were born unlucky, that perhaps the ancestors had destined her to suffer for reasons unseen. In this way, the girl's pain became a story that no one wanted to interrupt. Yet even in her quiet despair, there was something within her that endured. She bore the sting of salt on her hands and feet, the mockery of her step-siblings, and the weight of a stepmother's malice, but inside her eyes flickered a spark that refused to be extinguished. It was faint, hidden beneath layers of exhaustion and sorrow, but it was there, waiting. Her world was one of salt and silence, where every grain seemed to cut her skin and every silence deepened her loneliness. But as she grew, she began to understand something about the very substance used to break her. Salt preserved. Salt endured. No matter how it was scattered or dissolved, it remained. She began to sense, though she could not yet name it, that what was meant to destroy her might, in some strange way, become her strength. The village carried on, the trade of salt flowing steadily, the rituals continuing, the punishments whispered about but rarely questioned. Yet under the surface of all this ordinary life, there was a tension that no one could see. It was in the girl's weary but unbroken spirit, in the way her eyes sometimes gleamed when her stepmother thought she had won. Something was stirring, though not yet awakened, and salt, precious, cruel, eternal, would soon become the heart of her transformation. The day of punishment began not with the girl's failure but with the cunning whispers of her stepmother. A broken pot, a missing portion of grain, a task left undone. None of it was her doing, yet somehow it all became her fault. The stepmother's tongue was sharper than any blade, twisting truths until the villagers nodded in agreement, convinced of the girl's guilt. She stood silently, her lips trembling with words she dared not speak. She knew well that her voice would only feed the flames. The judgment was swift, cruel, and final. She was to kneel on salt. The villagers gathered as if it were some ritual spectacle, their eyes curious, some pitying but most indifferent. Salt was revered here, sacred in trade and ritual, but in this moment, it was turned into an instrument of pain. A mound of raw, jagged crystals was poured out in the clearing, glistening under the merciless sun. Each shard caught the light like a tiny blade. The girl stared at it, her body trembling, her breath shallow. She wanted to run, to vanish into the horizon where no voice could call her back, but her stepmother's grip on her arm was unyielding. With a shove, she was forced forward. "On your knees," the stepmother commanded, her voice thick with triumph. The girl lowered herself slowly, dread flooding every corner of her body. The first touch of her skin against the salt was like fire, sharp, searing, unrelenting. She gasped, her hands instinctively reaching for the ground as though to steady herself, but that only deepened her torment. The salt dug into her flesh, piercing like needles. Her knees quivered, already raw from days of labor, and now they burned as if pressed against embers. The crowd murmured, some shaking their heads, but no one stepped forward to stop it. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Her skin began to split, tiny cuts opening where the sharp grains pressed hardest. Sweat trickled down her face, stinging as it mingled with the salt dust. She bit her lip to silence her cries, for she knew the stepmother would relish the sound of her suffering. Instead, she lifted her head slightly, though her vision blurred with tears, and tried to focus on the horizon. The sun's glare mocked her, but she clung to the endless sky as if it were her only companion. Her step-siblings laughed from the side, their voices like cruel echoes. They mimicked her posture, clutching their knees in mock pain, stumbling about as though wounded, while the villagers chuckled at their performance. Each sound of laughter pressed down on the girl heavier than the salt itself. Her humiliation was complete, her pain transformed into entertainment. The stepmother's lips curled in satisfaction. This was more than punishment, it was spectacle, a way to break the girl not just in body but in spirit. As the minutes passed, the salt began to leave its mark. Her knees throbbed, her skin tore in deeper lines, and rivulets of blood traced their way down her shins. The salt crystals clung to the wounds, intensifying the agony. Her body shook, yet she refused to collapse. Somewhere deep within, beyond the torment, beyond the laughter, beyond the stepmother's gloating, something stronger stirred. She told herself she would not fall, not now, not before them. They might see her bleed, but they would not see her break. Time lost meaning. The girl could not tell if the sun had moved, if the crowd had shifted, or if her breath still came in steady rhythm. Pain consumed everything, and yet, strangely in its depth, she found a kind of clarity. She remembered the elders' words, how salt preserved what would otherwise decay. Perhaps, she thought faintly, it would preserve her too, not her flesh which burned and tore, but something deeper, something unyielding. At last, her stepmother, satisfied with the spectacle, raised her hand. "Enough," she declared, though her voice carried no mercy. The girl was dragged from the mound, her legs trembling, her knees raw and bloodied, grains of salt still embedded in her skin. She staggered but did not collapse. Her stepmother expected weakness, collapse, perhaps even unconsciousness, but the girl forced herself to stand, her breath ragged yet steady. She met no one's eyes, but her silence was not defeat. It was endurance, a quiet strength that unsettled even those who had laughed moments before. The villagers dispersed, muttering. Some spoke of cruelty, others dismissed it as deserved discipline, but all carried with them the image of the girl's endurance. The stepmother returned home with a satisfied smirk, yet unease flickered within her heart. For in her desire to break the girl, she had seen something unexpected, a resilience that no mound of salt could shatter. That night, as the girl lay on her mat, her knees throbbing and her skin torn, she did not sleep. Instead, she stared into the darkness, her mind alive with thoughts she could not yet name. The salt still burned in her wounds, but beneath the pain there was a strange sensation, as if the very crystals had left more than scars. They had pressed something into her, a force, a whisper, an awakening that she did not yet understand. The punishment was meant to end her spirit, but instead, it planted a seed. The pain was unlike anything she had ever endured. Each grain of salt was a cruel blade, pressing deeper into her skin with every breath she took. Her knees felt as though they were resting on a field of knives, the sharp edges cutting, scraping, and burrowing into flesh already raw from work and hardship. At first, she tried to shift her weight to ease the torment, but the stepmother's watchful eyes and the jeers of her step-siblings reminded her that even the smallest attempt at comfort would be twisted into weakness. She clenched her fists until her nails dug into her palms, forcing her trembling body to remain still. Every heartbeat drove the salt deeper. Her legs quivered and warm rivulets of blood seeped down her shins, darkening the dust beneath her. The salt crystals clung stubbornly to the wounds, stinging like fire, as though determined to carve their lesson into her body. She wanted to cry out, to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Instead, her silence carried across the village square, heavy and haunting, as if her suffering had become its own drumbeat, impossible to ignore. The villagers watched in a circle around her, their faces a blend of curiosity, cruelty, and unease. Some pitied her, their eyes soft with sorrow, yet none stepped forward to help. They shook their heads quietly, whispering among themselves, saying it was not their place to interfere in the matters of discipline. Others, however, reveled in her pain. They pointed and chuckled, whispering cruel remarks. Children, emboldened by their parents' indifference, mimicked her posture, clutching their knees and pretending to writhe, laughing as though her agony was a game. Each sound of mockery was a stone thrown into her chest, adding weight to her suffering. Her stepsister's voice rang louder than all. "Look at her," she called out, smirking. "She bleeds like a goat being slaughtered, yet she pretends to be strong." Her laughter, sharp and merciless, spread through the crowd like wildfire, infecting others with its venom. The stepmother, arms folded, nodded with satisfaction, as though the girl's torment was proof of her power. For her, this was not merely punishment, it was a declaration of control, a way to stamp out the last flicker of the girl's spirit. But even as the pain seared, even as her vision blurred from tears she refused to shed, the girl remained upright. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her lips trembling, but her silence defied the cruelty surrounding her. She would not give them the satisfaction of her screams. She knew that if she cried out, if she begged, the villagers would remember her as nothing but a broken child. But if she endured in silence, perhaps they would see something else, a strength no cruelty could erase. Time dragged on, every moment stretching endlessly. The sun bore down on her shoulders, her sweat mixing with the blood and salt until it felt as though her whole body was aflame. Yet still she did not collapse. She swayed slightly, her body frail and trembling, but she stayed on her knees, her back straight. The villagers fell quieter, some of the laughter dying out, replaced with an uneasy silence. Even those who had mocked her began to shift uncomfortably, as though her endurance accused them of their own cowardice. By the time her stepmother finally signaled for her to be pulled away, the girl's knees were torn and raw, her skin split into jagged wounds that burned with every movement. She staggered, nearly falling, but caught herself at the last moment, refusing to crumble before their eyes. The crowd dispersed, murmuring among themselves. Some spoke of cruelty, others of defiance, but all carried with them the image of her bloodied silence. The pain of the crystals had carved itself into her body, but also into their memory. And though she walked slowly, every step marked by agony, she carried something unbroken within her, an ember of resilience that no salt could extinguish. At first the pain was all she knew. The sharp crystals digging into her skin, the raw wounds opening wider with every heartbeat, the salt stinging like fire, it consumed her entire being. She felt as though her body was dissolving into the earth, as though the salt was pulling her apart. But as the night crept on and her strength seemed ready to abandon her, a strange shift occurred. In the midst of agony, a sound began to weave itself into her consciousness. It was not the laughter of her stepsister, nor the harsh commands of her stepmother, nor the low murmurs of the villagers. This sound was softer, gentler, carried by the very grains of salt pressed into her flesh. At first she thought it was a trick of her mind, a desperate attempt to escape the torment. But then the whispers grew clearer, weaving together like the faint hum of a song. The salt, each crystal a shard of earth, seemed alive with voices that spoke not with words but with rhythm, tone, and memory. She trembled, her lips parting slightly, listening. The agony dulled, not gone, but muted beneath the rising tide of whispers. They spoke of endurance. They spoke of pain as a pathway, of wounds as openings where the unseen world touched the flesh of the living. They told her she was not alone, that others before her had suffered beneath the weight of cruelty, and yet from that suffering had come strength. She was part of a chain stretching beyond the village, beyond her own life, into the depths of time where ancestors endured and survived. Each salt crystal was a voice, a fragment of the earth's memory, pressed into her skin so that she might hear what others could not. Her body shook with exhaustion, but her spirit straightened. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her lids she saw images painted by the whispers. Women bent beneath burdens, rising again and again, men scarred by battles, standing proudly in defiance, children taken too soon, their laughter echoing in the wind. She saw fields where salt had been spilled long ago, rivers carrying tears that glowed like moonlight, and huts filled with songs that survived even when voices were silenced. Every vision wrapped around her like a blanket, reminding her that her pain was not meaningless. The salt did not mock her, it did not tear her apart without reason. It was awakening her, binding her to the strength of those who came before. The whispers urged her to breathe through the pain, to let the salt carve its lessons into her skin, because those wounds would not remain wounds forever. They would become marks of power, etched testimonies of her resilience. Around her, the villagers continued their vigil. Some had grown restless and returned to their homes, but others lingered, still curious to see if she would break. They could not hear what she heard. To them, she was a trembling child kneeling on crystals, her face pale with exhaustion, her knees smeared with blood and salt. But inside she was no longer just a girl enduring cruelty. She was becoming something else, someone listening to the voices of the land itself. Her stepsister laughed loudly again, throwing a pebble at her back to provoke a reaction. But the girl did not move. The pebble bounced away, meaningless against the tide of whispers filling her. The stepmother's sharp voice cut the air, reminding her not to dare rise before permission was granted. Still, the girl remained silent, her pain transformed into listening. She no longer cared about the taunts. They seemed distant, faint echoes compared to the chorus swelling inside her. The salt crystals whispered of justice, not vengeance born of bitterness but balance born of truth. They told her that cruelty, when unchecked, poisons not just the victim but the whole village. They promised her that the pain she endured would ripple outward, that her suffering would become a mirror, forcing others to confront their own cruelty. And as the whispers grew louder, she realized something extraordinary. Her torment had become her initiation. What was meant to break her was shaping her into something greater. Her body remained on its knees, fragile, bleeding, and trembling. But her spirit stretched higher, reaching toward the voices that called her name from within the salt. She whispered back, not with words, but with her heartbeat, offering herself fully to the lessons carved in pain. She no longer saw herself as a victim, but as a vessel for something larger, something that pulsed in the earth, the air, and the ancient crystals beneath her. When the first faint breeze of dawn brushed against the village, those who watched saw only a girl who had survived the night in silence, her face strangely calm despite her torn flesh. They did not know that she had been listening, that the salt had spoken to her in ways they could never understand. The whispers faded with the rising light, leaving behind a quiet certainty in her chest. The girl understood now, her suffering would not be in vain. She carried the voices of the ancestors within her, and they would not be silenced. The villagers had expected her to collapse. They had expected her tears to mingle with the sharp crystals until the mound beneath her turned into a mixture of blood, salt, and despair. But instead, as she knelt there, trembling and broken, something unseen stirred inside her. Her body ached, her knees split open with red lines of pain, and yet beneath that torment, there was a force, a warmth that grew steadily, as though her very spirit had called upon something older than words. At first it was faint, like the ember of a forgotten fire. Then it began to spread. The salt beneath her knees felt different. It no longer bit with cold sharpness but seemed to soften, as though touched by breath or flame. The villagers frowned, murmuring, some leaning forward to see better. A boy rubbed his eyes and whispered to his mother that the salt was sweating. The stepmother, however, snapped her fingers for silence, unwilling to admit that anything unusual was happening. Yet all could see it. The once rigid mound was glistening, droplets forming where none should have been. The girl herself felt it more keenly than anyone. At first she thought she was hallucinating, that her mind had left her body and was spinning illusions to dull her pain. But then she realized it was real. The heat was coming from within her bones, rising through her skin, spreading through her wounds and into the salt itself. Every breath she took made the crystals tremble, every exhale sent a wave of warmth into the mound. The salt hissed faintly as if alive, as if responding to her pulse. The people began whispering among themselves. Salt did not melt without water, they reasoned. Tears could do little against so much. Blood could not dissolve such purity. And yet, before their eyes, the sharp mound grew wet, smooth, and soft. The girl's body seemed to glow faintly in the dying sun, her skin illuminated with a strange sheen, as though her suffering had called down something more than human endurance. The elders exchanged wary glances. They had punished many before. They had seen men whipped, women made to carry heavy stones, children sent to tasks beyond their strength. But never had they seen salt yield to flesh. Never had they seen pain turn into power. The stepmother's lips tightened as she tried to step forward, but something about the heat made her pause. She swore she could feel it in her own chest, an uncomfortable reminder that the world did not always bend to cruelty, that sometimes it bent back with fire. The girl's mind was no longer only on the pain. She was aware of the voices she had heard earlier, the whispers hidden in each crystal. Now, as the salt melted, the voices seemed to grow louder, clearer, no longer just echoes but chants. They were the words of women before her, ancestors whose trials had also burned, whose endurance had also birthed something new. They told her not to fall, not to surrender. They told her that the salt was not meant to consume her, but to reveal what she carried. It was not a punishment, it was a doorway. The mound sank lower as more crystals melted, leaving streaks of brine that spread across the earth. It smelled sharp, alive, like ocean air carried to a landlocked village. Some of the children clutched their mother's hands, frightened yet curious, for the earth seemed to hum beneath them. A young man dared to kneel and touch the brine, only to yank back his hand in awe. "It is warm," he whispered. "It is alive." The girl's body swayed, but she did not fall. The heat within her had taken over, though it drained her of strength, it kept her steady. She felt as though she had become both flame and salt, her pain transmuted into something unexplainable. She lifted her eyes slowly, meeting the gaze of the villagers who had come to see her humiliated. What they saw instead was transformation. She was no longer just the weak girl, the stepdaughter to be tormented. She had become something else, something that made them shiver, something that forced them to confront the cruelty they had silently allowed. One by one, the voices hushed until even the wind seemed to pause. The stepmother's hand trembled, though she tried to clench it into a fist. She had orchestrated this punishment to break the girl, to prove her weakness before all. But what stood before them was not weakness, it was the salt itself, bowing to her body, melting to her spirit. The girl closed her eyes once more, the heat still rising, and whispered under her breath words she did not know she knew, words that belonged to those before her. With each word, another crystal dissolved, another wound closed, another part of her spirit grew unshakable. By the time she opened her eyes, the mound was no longer there. In its place was a pool of brine that shimmered like liquid fire. And she was still kneeling, but not broken. She was unbent, her blood mixing not with defeat, but with something eternal. From the pool of brine that had replaced the mound of sharp crystals, something began to stir. At first, it was only a ripple, faint and uncertain, as though the liquid was catching its breath after its sudden transformation. Then the ripples grew stronger, moving against the wind, curling upward in delicate swirls of light. The villagers leaned forward, their eyes wide, their fear masked by silence. Salt was never supposed to behave this way. It was a thing of trade, of taste, of punishment, but never of life. Yet here, before their eyes, the pool shimmered as though the sun itself had fallen into it, bending and reshaping, until a form began to emerge. The girl, still kneeling though her body shook, felt the heat against her skin grow softer, less punishing, more like a caress. The brine rose higher, glowing faintly, its edges bending like liquid flame. Out of the ripples rose what seemed at first to be a shape without definition, a mass of shimmering salt water, sparkling as though filled with countless stars. Then slowly the mass shifted, moved with intent, and the people gasped. It was alive. The villagers could not decide whether it was a spirit, an omen, or a curse. It did not have a face, yet the light within its body gave the illusion of eyes that looked back at them, glowing with both sorrow and wrath. Its limbs seemed to form and unform, like a body made of water and light, forever on the edge of becoming something more. The stepmother stumbled backward, her confidence cracking for the first time. She had brought salt to destroy the girl, but now that same salt was rising against her will, infused with something beyond her control. Her lips parted as though to call it a trick, but no words came. Every villager knew tricks. This was no trick. This was a birth. The elders exchanged uneasy glances. Some clutched their charms, whispering prayers under their breath. Children hid behind their mothers, though a few brave ones peeked out, drawn by the strange beauty of the sight. The being's movements were fluid and mesmerizing, like the tide breathing in and out, though no sea lay near their village. The girl lifted her eyes and for the first time she felt no pain. The voices she had heard in the salt now echoed louder, clearer, surrounding her with warmth. They spoke through the living salt, their ancestral presence taking shape before her. She understood, without needing to be told, that the creature was not her enemy. It was her answer. It was the embodiment of all that she had endured, the crystallization of her suffering and resilience. Where her stepmother had meant to break her, she had instead unlocked something that could not be contained. The girl reached a trembling hand toward it, her fingers barely grazing the glow. The living salt pulsed in response, sending waves of warmth through her body, knitting her pain into strength. The villagers could not look away. There was beauty in the sight, the glistening light that refracted in countless colors, the way it bent the air around it as though reality itself bent to its presence. But there was also dread. For in its shifting glow they sensed judgment. It was not only alive, it was aware. It seemed to carry with it the memory of cruelty, the weight of silence, the cost of blood unjustly demanded. When it turned its faceless gaze toward the crowd, many lowered their eyes, ashamed of how they had stood by and watched. The stepmother, however, froze where she stood, her body rigid, her breath shallow. For though the being had no face, its gaze rested on her longer than any other, heavy with the promise that what had been born would not be forgotten. The pool swirled, the being rising higher, its glow spreading until it seemed the whole village was bathed in silver fire. The girl's hair shimmered under the light, her skin glowing with a radiance that was not of this world. Her torment had given birth to something eternal, something that could never again be hidden. The salt, once weapon, had become witness, and now it lived. From the pool of brine that had replaced the mound of sharp crystals, something began to stir. At first, it was only a ripple, faint and uncertain, as though the liquid was catching its breath after its sudden transformation. Then the ripples grew stronger, moving against the wind, curling upward in delicate swirls of light. The villagers leaned forward, their eyes wide, their fear masked by silence. Salt was never supposed to behave this way. It was a thing of trade, of taste, of punishment, but never of life. Yet here, before their eyes, the pool shimmered as though the sun itself had fallen into it, bending and reshaping, until a form began to emerge. The girl, still kneeling though her body shook, felt the heat against her skin grow softer, less punishing, more like a caress. The brine rose higher, glowing faintly, its edges bending like liquid flame. Out of the ripples rose what seemed at first to be a shape without definition, a mass of shimmering salt water, sparkling as though filled with countless stars. Then slowly the mass shifted, moved with intent, and the people gasped. It was alive. The villagers could not decide whether it was a spirit, an omen, or a curse. It did not have a face, yet the light within its body gave the illusion of eyes that looked back at them, glowing with both sorrow and wrath. Its limbs seemed to form and unform, like a body made of water and light, forever on the edge of becoming something more. The stepmother stumbled backward, her confidence cracking for the first time. She had brought salt to destroy the girl, but now that same salt was rising against her will, infused with something beyond her control. Her lips parted as though to call it a trick, but no words came. Every villager knew tricks. This was no trick. This was a birth. The elders exchanged uneasy glances. Some clutched their charms, whispering prayers under their breath. Children hid behind their mothers, though a few brave ones peeked out, drawn by the strange beauty of the sight. The being's movements were fluid and mesmerizing, like the tide breathing in and out, though no sea lay near their village. The girl lifted her eyes, and for the first time she felt no pain. The voices she had heard in the salt now echoed louder, clearer, surrounding her with warmth. They spoke through the living salt, their ancestral presence taking shape before her. She understood, without needing to be told, that the creature was not her enemy. It was her answer. It was the embodiment of all that she had endured, the crystallization of her suffering and resilience. Where her stepmother had meant to break her, she had instead unlocked something that could not be contained. The girl reached a trembling hand toward it, her fingers barely grazing the glow. The living salt pulsed in response, sending waves of warmth through her body, knitting her pain into strength. The villagers could not look away. There was beauty in the sight, the glistening light that refracted in countless colors, the way it bent the air around it as though reality itself bent to its presence. But there was also dread. For in its shifting glow they sensed judgment. It was not only alive, it was aware. It seemed to carry with it the memory of cruelty, the weight of silence, the cost of blood unjustly demanded. When it turned its faceless gaze toward the crowd, many lowered their eyes, ashamed of how they had stood by and watched. The stepmother, however, froze where she stood, her body rigid, her breath shallow. For though the being had no face, its gaze rested on her longer than any other, heavy with the promise that what had been born would not be forgotten. The pool swirled, the being rising higher, its glow spreading until it seemed the whole village was bathed in silver fire. The girl's hair shimmered under the light, her skin glowing with a radiance that was not of this world. Her torment had given birth to something eternal, something that could never again be hidden. The salt, once weapon, had become witness, and now it lived. The salt being glided forward, not with footsteps but with movements like waves rolling silently across sand. Each ripple carried a soft glow, and wherever it passed the earth seemed to shiver. The villagers drew back instinctively, though none dared flee. Something about the being held them in place, as though its presence weighed on their chests, pressing them down into honesty they had long avoided. The night was utterly still except for the low hum it carried, a sound like countless grains of salt grinding together, whispering the echoes of forgotten voices. The elders stood frozen, their staffs clutched tightly, their lips moving in broken prayers. These were men who had always claimed wisdom, who had declared punishments and judged innocence with authority. But under the gaze of the salt being, their words faltered. They could no longer pretend that their silence had been neutrality. They had seen the girl's suffering, heard her muffled cries as she bled on the mound of salt, yet had chosen not to interfere. Now that silence lay on their shoulders like chains, and the shimmering being seemed to tighten them with every pulse of light. Women pressed their children closer, shielding their faces, though the little ones peered out with wide, unblinking eyes. To them the being was not only terror but wonder. They had been raised on stories of spirits that walked among mortals, of ancestors who returned when justice had been lost. Now one such spirit had come, born not in triumph but in torment. The children would never forget the glow, nor the way their parents' proud faces twisted with fear. Men who had mocked the girl shifted uneasily, their earlier laughter choking in their throats. They had watched her kneel, ridiculed her weakness, even added to her humiliation with words sharp as blades. Now when the salt being's faceless form drifted near them, their bodies quivered. Some stumbled backward, their knees buckling. One man dropped to the ground entirely, muttering apologies though no one had accused him aloud. The being's presence dragged hidden guilt to the surface, exposing it like wounds that could no longer be covered. The stepmother, trembling but trying to mask her fear, pressed her hands against her chest. Her lips curled in a false sneer, but sweat poured down her brow. She wanted to deny what she saw, to claim it as trickery, but the glow reflected in her eyes betrayed the truth. She was terrified. When the being swayed in her direction, she stumbled backward, colliding with a wall. It did not touch her, yet its silence pressed heavier than any blow. She could feel its judgment pouring into her, measuring the weight of her cruelty, and she shook as though her bones themselves knew she was guilty. The villagers exchanged glances, their fear deepening with each passing moment. It was not only the being that unnerved them but the reflection it forced upon their hearts. They remembered every time they had turned away from injustice, every cruel word they had let stand unchallenged, every silence that had cost another their dignity. And though none spoke it aloud, they all knew that they had helped the stepmother in her cruelty, not by action but by their inaction. The salt being moved among them like a living mirror, revealing the stains they carried. Some wept openly, clutching the earth and begging forgiveness from ancestors they had ignored. Others tried to hide, but the glow seeped through walls, through shadows, stripping away every excuse. The girl, still kneeling though her wounds were healed by the being's warmth, watched in silence. For the first time she saw her tormentors lower their heads, not to mock her but to bow in shame. The balance of power had shifted. She, the girl they called weak, had become the vessel of something greater, something their cruelty had summoned but could not control. The being's light pulsed brighter, then dimmer, like the beat of a heart. Each pulse seemed to spread through the village, making the huts tremble, rattling bowls and tools, shaking loose the dust from the rooftops. It was as if the land itself was answering, declaring that it, too, had borne witness to the girl's pain. No one could deny it anymore. The night stretched long, filled with the soft hum of salt and the heavy breathing of frightened villagers. Not a single drum sounded, not a single bird sang. The salt being moved with deliberate slowness, giving every person in the village a chance to face themselves. When it paused near the girl once more, its glow seemed to fold around her like wings of light. She felt no fear, only the certainty that her suffering had not been in vain. By the time dawn threatened the horizon, the village was changed. No one dared speak above a whisper, as though words themselves might anger the spirit. Shame lingered in the air, heavy and inescapable. The salt being had not harmed them with hands or fire, yet it had undone them all. Their cruelty was no longer hidden, and their silence had been judged. And though the being said nothing, each villager understood the same truth. They would never forget this night, nor the girl whose pain had called a spirit into life. The stepmother was the first to feel the sting. As the salt being drifted closer, its shimmering glow seemed to break apart into countless tiny grains. They swirled in the air, sparkling like dust in sunlight, but when they touched her skin she shrieked. The grains clung to her arms, her face, her hair, burrowing into her flesh with a burn sharper than fire. She clawed at her skin, desperate to scrape them away, but the more she struggled, the tighter they clung. Her proud, mocking laughter, the same sound she had used to belittle the girl, was replaced by hoarse screams that carried across the village. The stepsisters tried to run, but the salt being moved like a tide, cutting off every escape. It poured around them, seeping into their clothes, stinging every inch of their bodies. They collapsed onto the ground, writhing, their once arrogant voices reduced to desperate cries. The salt forced its way into their mouths when they screamed, drying their throats, making them choke on their own cruelty. They had laughed at the girl's suffering, jeered at her bleeding knees, and now their own mouths knew only pain. The stepbrothers fared no better. The salt clung to their feet, eating into their soles as though to mock the strength they once used to kick dust at the girl. Every step they took sent waves of agony through their legs until they fell to their knees, their pride stripped away. They tried to shake the grains off, beating at their bodies with frantic hands, but the salt moved like a living thing, flowing to wherever it could wound them most. The more they fought, the more it consumed. The stepmother, choking between screams, turned her eyes toward the girl. Hatred and fear burned together in her gaze, but when she tried to curse, the salt forced its way into her mouth. Her words dissolved on her tongue, silenced by the very element she had used as punishment. Her knees buckled, her body convulsed, and she collapsed in the dirt, reduced to the same posture she had once forced upon her stepdaughter. Around them, the villagers watched in horrified silence. Some turned away, unable to bear the sight, but most could not look elsewhere. They had known the stepfamily's cruelty, many had even laughed along. But now they saw that cruelty returned in full, magnified by the power of something they could not understand. Their ears rang with the stepfamily's tortured screams, and the sound was a mirror of the girl's muffled cries they had ignored for so long. The salt being gave no speech, no explanation. It simply carried out a justice that required no words. Its grains moved with precision, punishing each act of mockery, each cruelty that had once seemed so small. The girl stood still, her wounds now closed, her face calm. She did not smile at her stepfamily's torment, but neither did she weep. She understood that this was not her doing, it was the salt itself, the spirit awakened by her suffering, carrying out what had been long overdue. By the time the screams grew hoarse and weak, the stepfamily lay sprawled on the ground, their bodies streaked with raw red burns where the salt had seared their skin. Their laughter, which had once filled the hut and the village with scorn, was gone forever. They would never again mock the girl, for their voices had been broken into nothing but cries. And though they lived, every villager who watched knew that their torment would cling to them as surely as the salt had clung to their flesh. The morning sun had risen higher by the time the cries of the stepfamily faded into silence, leaving only the uneasy breathing of the villagers. The air smelled of raw earth and something sharp, like the tang of salt carried on the wind. The people stood in clusters, their faces pale and their hands trembling, unsure whether to run or fall to their knees. The salt being lingered in the square, shimmering with a light that did not come from the sun, and every grain that formed its body seemed alive, watching, remembering. The elders, men and women who had sat in judgment for years, could not move. Their eyes darted from the suffering stepfamily to the girl who stood tall and calm, her wounds healed, her face radiant in a way that unsettled them. They had once nodded in agreement when the stepmother suggested cruel punishments. They had believed silence kept order. But now silence felt heavier than stone. Finally, the oldest among them, his back bent and his voice thin, whispered the truth none dared to say aloud: "Salt does not forget." His words spread through the crowd like ripples on still water. Others echoed him in their hearts, realizing that what they had always treated as ordinary, something to season food, to preserve meat, to sting wounds, had revealed itself as something far greater. Salt, the humble crystal they traded and measured, had become a mirror of their deeds. They remembered how they had let the girl's punishment unfold. Some had pitied her in silence, others had laughed along with the stepfamily, and still others had simply turned their backs, pretending her suffering was none of their concern. Now they understood. Every grain of salt under her knees had recorded their silence, their laughter, their cowardice. And when the salt dissolved into living form, it was not only her stepfamily that was judged, it was them all. One elder raised his trembling hand and said, "We thought salt burned only the flesh. But today we have learned it burns the heart first. Cruelty corrodes faster than crystals cut." His words shook the villagers. They began to murmur, voices low, admitting their part in what had happened. For the first time they felt shame, not for being caught, but for realizing that cruelty had lived among them, and they had nourished it with their silence. The salt being hovered, its form shifting like waves as though listening to their confessions. Its glow dimmed and brightened as if responding to the honesty in their words. The girl, standing beside it, spoke quietly, "You gave me salt to break me. But the salt showed me truth, it is your cruelty that breaks you." Her voice was calm, not accusing, but its weight was heavier than any elder's judgment. The villagers bowed their heads. Some women covered their faces, weeping quietly. Men who had once laughed at the girl now shuffled their feet, unable to meet her eyes. Children who had repeated their parents' mockery clung to their mothers' skirts, their innocence no longer untouched. The entire village felt as though the salt had passed through them, searching, exposing, burning. The elders gathered together, speaking in low, urgent tones. They knew this moment would define their people for generations. If they ignored what they had seen, the salt would surely rise again, fiercer, hungrier. If they learned from it, perhaps they could cleanse the wounds they had opened with their cruelty. One elder turned to the girl and bowed low before her. "We wronged you. We wronged ourselves. Salt, which we thought to be an instrument of pain, has judged us. We will never again use it to wound. From this day, it will be treated only with reverence as a reminder of what cruelty unleashes." Others joined him, falling to their knees. Soon the entire village knelt, not in worship of the girl, but in recognition of the truth she had revealed. The Steppe family lay groaning in the dirt, their bodies broken by the salt's justice. They had been made into living examples of what unchecked cruelty becomes. From that day forward, the village changed its ways. Salt was no longer scattered as punishment. Instead, it was placed in the center of gatherings as a sacred reminder. At feasts, before the people ate, they would pass a small bowl of salt and touch it to their lips, whispering, "Let my heart not corrode." Parents told their children the tale of the girl who was made to kneel until her skin split, only for the salt to come alive and reveal justice. They taught them that cruelty could be hidden for a time, but it never vanished. It dissolved, transformed, and returned with a power none could withstand. The girl herself became a symbol, not of revenge but of endurance. She did not boast of what had happened, nor did she hold her suffering like a weapon. She simply lived, her strength quiet, her presence a constant reminder of what the village had once done. Her silence was more powerful than any elder's decree, for in it the people heard the echo of their own shame. And so the elders declared a new law: salt belongs to the living and the spirits. It will not be used to wound but to bind us to truth. Whoever uses it in cruelty will answer to it, as surely as fire consumes dry grass. From that day forward, the villagers feared salt not for its sting but for its memory. They feared cruelty more, for they now knew it corroded faster than salt on flesh, spreading unseen until it consumed everything. And whenever they passed the girl in the square, they lowered their heads, reminded that her suffering had forced them to see themselves clearly for the first time. The lesson of salt was etched into their lives. Cruelty may be sharp, but justice, like salt, seeps everywhere, clings to every wound, and never forgets.